Thanks. Well, good morning, everyone. It's very good to see you here this morning. My name's Kathleen Newland, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Migration Policy Institute, both those of you who are here in the room and those of you who are joining us by live stream. I'd like to welcome you to this event, which we've called Taming the Seas, Safety, Protection, and Attempts to Create Order in Maritime Migration. This event is the sort of official release for our book, All at Sea, The Policy Challenges of Rescue, Interception, and Long-Term Response to Maritime Migration. I'd like to remind especially those of you who are joining us by live stream that when we get to the discussion part of this event, that you can tweet questions to @migrationpolicy, or use event #MPI discuss, or you can email questions to events@migrationpolicy.org. And I have my cell phone here. I'd like to assure those of you, if I'm looking at my cell phone, it's not because I'm distracted, it's because I'm looking for questions from our remote audience, or at least that's my story and I'm sticking with it. So it's a real pleasure to welcome three people who've been deeply involved with the issues of maritime migration over the years. First, my co-author, Kate Hooper, who's an associate policy analyst at the Migration Policy Institute. Katie Tobin, an associate protection officer of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, who, in addition to her work at UNHCR, has in the past worked at the Department of Homeland Security, where she was one of the people assigned to the Coast Guard cutters that were in interdiction operations, so she has seen this issue from many sides. And Michelle Gabaudin, the president of Refugees International, also a longtime staff member in very senior positions at UNHCR. And I think Michelle is well known to many of you as someone who closely follows refugee and displacement issues around the world. And Michelle has just returned from Greece, I mean, literally almost within the last 24 hours. So he will be able to give us a very vivid and up-to-date picture of the impact that the EU-Turkey agreement is having on flows across the Eastern Mediterranean, and the impact that that's having on the people who have made this crossing and what their expectations might be now. I want to start by just telling you a little bit about the genesis of this book. About a little more than 2 years ago, I was invited by the Australian Department of Immigration and Border Protection to a series of what they called high-level strategic discussions, which involved people from across the Australian government. And one of the topics they were deeply concerned with was maritime migration. There was a new government, and they were instituting a very, very hardline policy on people attempting to arrive in Australia by boat. And they had seen work that we had done at MPI several years ago in 2006-07. I'm delighted that the editor and main author of that report, Joanne Van Selm, is with us today. Initially, we thought this would be a fairly simple matter of updating that work, but of course it turned out as the year 2014 wore on, that it became a much larger and more complex and more highly politicized topic than we had anticipated. Not that it wasn't always a highly political topic, but we found that this really became a full-fledged new book. And we focused on 5 case studies: the Mediterranean, the Caribbean, the Red Sea, Gulf of Aden, the maritime approaches to Australia, and the Bay of Bengal, Andaman Sea area. And Kate has very kindly prepared some maps just to get us oriented. And why don't we put up the first one, the Mediterranean, just to remind you of one of the things I want to remind you of is to is the extreme complexity and dynamism of this issue in every part of the world. Rather than going through the case studies one by one, what I want to do in just these few minutes is to sort of pull out some of the observations that I think emerge from all of them to differing degrees. And I think I can summarize those observations in just sort of 5 or 6 points, one of which is about unintended consequences. As you probably know, travel by sea on a global basis accounts for just quite a small proportion of refugees and migrants, but it gets a disproportionate amount of attention from policymakers and from the media and from the public, partly because it's so dangerous and it presents such challenges to sovereign control of national borders. To a lot of people, it conjures up echoes of invasion, and of course, it also presents really sort of heart-rending images of suffering and death when boats founder, and I think it's, all of us react to those at a very basic level. For these reasons and others, I think maritime migration has been particularly met with crisis-driven responses. I think this is particularly true in the Mediterranean. In fact, this issue sort of burst on the scene in October 2014 with the first of the big high-profile shipwrecks off the island of Lampedusa, in which 366, 67, 68, no one seems to be sure really of what the exact figure is, but about 366 people died. And that really galvanized a response from the Italian government, driven by public outcry, including from the Pope. And the Italian Navy mounted a big search and rescue operation throughout the Mediterranean and found no other partners among European countries to help with this operation. So after about a year, the Italians said, look, we can't do this alone, and ceased their operation. The EU stepped up with a sort of border patrol, much smaller scale border patrol operation operating 30 miles off the European coast. But the death rates inevitably went up. And it wasn't until April of 2015, there was another huge shipwreck. Over 700 people lost their lives. And then another round of responses and a stepping up of rescue at sea. And I think that's a pattern that we see in many parts of the world, as sort of crisis-driven response that ebbs and flows depending on events. And these crisis-driven policies are indeed rife with unintended consequences. For example, when you have stepped-up border control measures which are intended to deter unauthorized migration, as we do, in almost all of these areas. These often leave refugees with no legal way to arrive at a place where they can press their claim. That is not the at least stated policy of these operations, but it certainly tends to be a consequences. More intense and sophisticated measures to intercept boats, in another unintended consequences, have taken these journeys out of the hands of amateurs and peoples themselves and placed them very firmly in the hands of professional smugglers, many of which are part of ruthless criminal networks. These increasingly sophisticated tactics on the part of smugglers pose a major challenge to policymakers and have layered an additional danger onto the refugees' experience of persecution and flight. And I'm sure some of you have read and seen some of these terrible images. I recently was on a panel commenting on the Italian film called Fire at Sea, and if you haven't had a chance to see it, I would recommend it very highly. It's a searing picture of of what migrants on these smugglers' boats go through, the chemical burns, the suffocation, the unbelievable overcrowding, and the attendant dangers. One of the tactics that has really posed a challenge to policy and programs on this issue is what I call engineered helplessness. Whereas in the past, the smugglers' tactics was to try to evade detection and land people undeterred. But that has almost, that's a sort of minority tactic these days, and the main tactic is to get people out just beyond territorial waters and then call in rescue, or put these very unseaworthy boats in major shipping channels where the smugglers assure people that they will be rescued and that it's only a matter of time. They just have to get out there and call search and rescue, and the cavalry will be on the way. Of course, that is far more, that's a very unrealistic picture, and many boats founder in the dark on this vast and unpredictable sea, and rescue is not so common. Well, it's very common. I mean, hundreds of thousands of people have been rescued, but we don't really know the number who have failed to be rescued. We know that so far this year, there's been some 3,800 recorded deaths in the Mediterranean, which is larger than the total for all of last year, when the numbers were much lower overall. So the death rates have gone up substantially this year. One of the consequences of this this tactic of sort of engineered helplessness is that people are encouraged to take greater risks and sort of allow themselves to be crammed into these boats because of at least in part, well, mainly because they have no other options, but also because of a false confidence that rescue will be on the way. Another sort of thing that these situations have in common is what I call the sort of blind men and the elephant metaphor. I'm sure you all know that story of 6 blind men who went up to see an elephant, and each one of them touched a different part of the beast, and one of them concluded, touching the leg, that an elephant was like a tree, and the other touched the ear and said, no, it's like a leaf, and the other touched a tusk and said, no, it's like a spear. Well, refugees, asylum seekers, and stateless people and other migrants travel together on these clandestine sea routes. And there are different sort of departments and agencies within government that have the task of responding to different groups, and they don't necessarily have a coordinated policy. And when you have this multiplicity of actors, states and their official structures like border control agencies and navies, you have private sector interests, fishing vessels, commercial shipping, you have the international humanitarian agencies like UNHCR, and civil society organizations, both operationally humanitarian organizations and human rights defenders. And you have the criminal syndicates that are exploiting people's desperation. Like the blind men and the elephant, each one of these actors has a different perception of what the issue is. One sees it as an issue of humanitarian protection, another sees it as a law enforcement issue, another as a national security issue, another as a political issue, another as a profit center. So not only does each of them have a different perspective, but each of them responds to different laws and regulations and standard operating procedures and incentives and norms, and this makes coherent policies on maritime migration very difficult to achieve and to implement. What happens after rescue? This is one of the issues that, that helps to determine countries' attitudes toward rescue and also the attitude of some of these private actors. The apparent resolution of the problem in one part of the world has a great tendency to be like squeezing a balloon. If you think you've solved it in one part of the world, it tends to pop up in another. And we're seeing a perfect example of this now in the Caribbean, and I'm sure Katie will talk about that more, where a quite effective interdiction program has channeled people onto the land routes. So we've seen something on the order of, close to 50,000 people approaching the U.S. border through Mexico, having traveled to Ecuador, to, in some cases, even to Brazil, and to Panama, and then trying to make their way up to Costa Rica, trying to make their way up. Sometimes these are journeys that begin with a boat journey and then proceed by land, and sometimes they're a combination of air, land, sea, or some combination of that. And that process of squeezing the balloon, I think, is particularly true when people are moving by sea, because unlike a border fence, although they are not nearly as effective as politicians claim, a sea barrier is never fixed. It requires a continuing, ongoing investment over an indefinite period, or that balloon will sort of bulge out again. I've described in the book maritime, irregular or unauthorized maritime migration as a wicked problem. That's a term that's borrowed from urban planning, and it describes extremely complex, hard to resolve problems that are dynamic and interconnected and resistant to solutions. Two of the major challenges in confronting problems like that, wicked problems, are defining the problem and identifying the goals. And again, because you have different actors with different goals, and defining the problem in different ways, it's a real policy challenge. Defining the problem is difficult because wicked problems are both causes and symptoms of other problems. Going back to the blind men and the elephant, the explanation of the problem depends on the perspective of the observer. So maritime migration is closely connected to poverty, repression, violence, hopelessness, inequality, the growth of organized crime, the rise of right-wing populism, the erosion of international norms, and dozens of other equally wicked problems. So that really means that this is a problem that's not likely to be solved. One of my first messages to policymakers on this is abandon hope, but not seriously. Abandon hope of solving this problem like once and for all. But of course, we should not abandon hope of managing it better. This implies that states are going to have to learn to live with imperfection, to engage in a constant process of trial and error, and not expect to solve a problem that's too difficult, dynamic, and complex to be finally resolved. You have overlapping and sometimes contradictory legal regimes, the law of the sea, refugee law, human rights law, national security laws. So this managing this problem is going to have to be a long, hard, and above all, persistent effort. That brings me to my final point about international cooperation. And that is that the failure to cooperate and share the responsibilities of protection at sea is leading to greater disorder in migration corridors and to less protection for refugees and other migrants. Countries of first asylum and the frontline coastal states are experiencing growing pressure, both from within and without, growing pressure from refugees and migrant arrivals driven by conflict and all the other root causes, you know. And if states are left to deal with those problems on their own, without international cooperation, especially the low and middle income states, you get back to these unintended consequences, to states that may resort to pushbacks, as we've certainly seen in the past, pushbacks to even less capable or less willing countries. They may tolerate irregular departures to other countries, as many of the transit countries have been accused of doing, and they may suffer from growing lawlessness associated with the presence of criminal elements attracted by smuggling opportunities. So the cost of not cooperating are very high, and they escalate if they don't even start until a crisis is very nearly out of control. This topic is a rather personal one to me. I'm the daughter of a naval captain. You know, I grew up with the singing the Navy hymn, and about those in peril on the sea and so on. And this is it's the challenge not only to policy but to conscience, I think, in a way that is able perhaps to draw our attention not only to the needs of those at sea, but to protection needs and the need for humane and dignified treatment for migrants everywhere. So let me stop with those remarks, sort of very much an overview of the policy implications of this issue, and turn to Kate initially for some more specifics. Kate wrote the chapter about the Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea, one of the most neglected and dangerous maritime routes in the world.
Thanks, Kathleen. So as Kathleen says, maritime migration in this region has garnered much less attention than the Mediterranean, but it's still one of the most dangerous routes in the world. So I'm going to provide you with a quick overview about what we know about who's on the move and why. So here are some quick facts. The number of people undertaking this journey has quadrupled over the past 10 years. In 2015, nearly 100,000 people crossed the Red Sea or the Gulf of Aden to reach Yemen and the Gulf states, and that's during the devastating civil war in Yemen. As you can see on the slide, there are two routes to reach Yemen. The first from Djibouti on the left across the Red Sea, and the second, much longer route from the Puntland coast across the Gulf of Aden. As of 10 years ago, most people undertaking these journeys were Somalis, but growing numbers of Ethiopians have traveled this route in recent years, accounting for 90% of journeys last year. And many people lose their lives making these journeys. In 2007, more than 1,000 people were reported to have died during these crossings, and that's likely an underestimate. And what's more, there are numerous reports documenting the horrific abuse that migrants face at the hands of smugglers. This includes physical and sexual assault, being forced overboard and drowning, suffocation from overcrowding, and kidnapping and extortion when they arrive in Yemen. So why are people undertaking such a risky route? One key driver is widespread poverty and a lack of economic opportunities, particularly for young people. The Horn of Africa is one of the poorest regions in the world, and there's a huge market for migrant workers in Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries. Many Ethiopians undertake this journey so they can find work in the Gulf states as manual laborers or working in clerical or service sectors. And to give you an idea of scale, last year international migrants made up 1/3 of Saudi Arabia's total population. And this follows huge efforts by Saudi lawmakers to try and reduce their reliance on foreign labor. So by encouraging businesses to employ Saudi nationals and deporting unauthorized migrant workers. Between November 2013 and March 2014, Saudi authorities deported nearly 200,000 Ethiopians back to Ethiopia during one of these crackdowns. And another important driver is conflict. Between 1990 and 2010, the Horn of Africa experienced more than 200 armed conflicts. And this, of course, includes the war in Somalia. And spikes in conflict can rapidly transform both the volume and the direction of flows. For example, the number of people traveling from the Horn of Africa to Yemen started rising from 2006 as fighting against al-Shabaab, the Somali militant group, intensified. And more recently, following the outbreak of civil war in Yemen, we saw flows in both directions, people continuing to cross from the Horn of Africa to Yemen, while others are fleeing Yemen in the opposite direction, trying to escape the fighting. So policymakers who want to try and stop these dangerous journeys face three conundrums. The first is widespread poverty and young populations who want to migrate to find better opportunities. The second is political instability, which drives people from their homes, but it also makes it much easier for them to travel through these regions undetected, despite the obvious dangers. And the third is weak governance and limited resources in many of these countries, which can limit the political will to tackle these issues. So what can policymakers do? One obvious step is to crack down on smuggling operations, for example, by improving the rule of law in these regions and increasing patrols at sea. But it's important to remember that this isn't just an enforcement issue. Policymakers also need to address the root causes driving these flows. So one element is security, which is resolving the conflicts and the instability that displace people in the first place. But it's also an issue of economic opportunity. You can warn people about the dangers of these journeys, but they'll still go if you don't provide them with real alternatives. So investing in education and livelihoods in these communities and offering them more opportunities for legal migration.
Thank you very much, Kate. That is, I'm really glad that you were here to draw our attention to this particular region, because it is one of the ones that we hear least about, and is certainly deserving of much more attention that they get. The stories that you hear out of these camps of people being, people's relatives being called and hearing their relative being tortured by the smugglers to extract more money is just what happens in a lawless region, not unlike the coast of Libya in some cases these days. So maybe you could give us the Caribbean map. Sure. As we turn to Katie to give us something of UNH CR's perspective, as well as the benefits of her own experience, which are vast.
Okay, well, thank you, Kathleen. I just want to say first, thank you to you and to MPI for inviting UNHCR to be a part of this discussion. This is very much a priority issue for UNHCR. We see this as a part of our very much intimately related with the global refugee crisis that we're facing, and as you mentioned in your remarks, something that's maybe overlooked a bit in the national and international discourse. So we appreciate you elevating the issue. I think this book, All at Sea, really does a great job of showing the global dimension of this issue.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think that this discussion too this week is timely. As you mentioned, UNHCR just yesterday announced that the death toll in the Mediterranean has reached a record high. Just in the first 10 months of 2016, there's been nearly 4,000 deaths in the Mediterranean. These numbers are particularly troubling, I think, when you look at the trends of boat crossings in the Mediterranean as a whole. So in 2015, there were over 1 million boat crossings in the Mediterranean. That number has significantly reduced in 2016, only about a third, about 300,000 total. Yet the number of deaths has increased. So that's a very troubling dynamic and something that gives pause, and we really need to question why is that happening. So I think there's a lot of factors at play there. We've seen in response to these unprecedented numbers of boat crossings in the Mediterranean, increased legal and physical barriers, increased investment in interdiction and enforcement efforts, yet not necessarily addressing the root causes. The majority of those that have been crossing from the Mediterranean are coming from refugee-producing countries, Syria, Afghanistan, parts of Africa, with a lot of ongoing violence and turmoil, and so we find that these people are continuing to look for ways to reach safety, and often taking more perilous routes, relying more on criminal smugglers and things like that. So this conversation's deeply important in this moment. For UNHCR, we see protection at sea as a very important part of our mandate to protect and find solutions for refugees. We know that in these boat crossings, in these maritime migration flows, that not everyone is a refugee. Yet, in the current state of affairs, where we're dealing with a refugee crisis of over 65 million people, we know that there are refugees in the flow. Also, as you mentioned, stateless people and other vulnerable populations. So we see that we have a responsibility just as much on land, but also at sea, to make sure that we identify and offer protection to these people that are fleeing persecution and other forms of violence. Within the UNHCR's legal framework, the 1951 Convention, the Refugee Convention, the cornerstone really of that convention is Article 33, the principle of non-refoulement. So that's this principle that no state shall return someone to a country where they would face persecution. And so UNHCR's interpretation of Article 33, our position, is that there are no territorial limits to this principle of non-refoulement. So whether a state encounters an individual, a refugee at its border, or encounters them at sea during a search and rescue operation, that this principle of non-refoulement, this obligation to protect that individual, exists wherever that person is. So what does this mean practically? UNHCR calls on all states to ensure that there are screening mechanisms in place, so that people that would be interdicted at sea would go through some sort of a protection screening to determine if they may be a refugee before repatriation efforts would be executed. So this is certainly a tall order. It's, as you mentioned, this is a wicked problem. We have certain states, certain coastal states, often not the most highly resourced, that are confronted with these large maritime migration flows. And I'll speak a little bit about that in the Caribbean context. There's certainly a desperate need to have safeguards in place to identify and protect refugees, but it's not easy, and it's really something that requires much more of a coordinated response. So yes, within my career, I have spent a significant amount of time working in the Caribbean. For the last 4 years, on behalf of UNHCR, I've been a part of our Caribbean Protection Unit based here in Washington. And we work very closely with not only the U.S. government, that obviously is very engaged in migrant interdiction in the Caribbean, but also some of the other countries that are very much affected. One that I wanted to highlight that I've worked very closely with over the last couple years is the Bahamas. And if you look on the map, the poor Bahamas, they are located literally directly in between the two major source countries in the Caribbean, Haiti and Cuba, and the United States. So it's a very small country with a lot of small islands, a very small, under-resourced naval fleet, and they receive large numbers of arrivals from Cuba and Haiti every year. And so countries like the Bahamas, Turks and Caicos, the Cayman Islands, the Dominican Republic, these small island states are faced with very large migration flows. So the Caribbean is a region that, when you compare it to the Mediterranean and some others, the scale is much smaller, but it's an ongoing problem. For decades, really, we've seen ebbs and flows of people fleeing Cuba and Haiti and other countries, sometimes the Dominican Republic as well, due to different civil unrest, poverty, oppression, a variety of factors. And the U.S. is certainly the biggest player in the game, and they do provide a lot of support to these island countries. There's a lot of bilateral agreements that exist between the United States and the Bahamas, the Dominican Republic, Haiti, Cuba, that really dictate how migrant interdiction functions, screening, protection, and all of that. As Kathleen mentioned, before I was with UNHCR, I worked for the Department of Homeland Security, and I was involved in conducting the credible fear screenings aboard Coast Guard cutters for Cubans that were interdicted. And it's actually, there, I think the book does a great job of laying out the procedures, the U.S. policies at play in the Caribbean. But due to bilateral agreements between Cuba and the United States, all Cubans that are interdicted by the U.S. Coast Guard, whether within the U.S. territorial waters or at the high seas, do receive a credible fear interview by a U.S. Asylum or refugee officer. So, yeah, I could speak at great length about that, but
I'm sure we'll come back to it in the
Yeah.
discussion.
But I wanted to close by talking a little bit about what UNHCR is doing globally to address this. We're seeing, serious challenges in the Caribbean, in the Mediterranean, and in other parts of the world, and these are not easy issues to. The solutions are not obvious, and so I think in 2014, UNHCR convened states in the High Commissioner's dialogue on protection at sea. So we brought together a lot of the countries that are most directly affected by this and NGOs to come and discuss the issues and come up with solutions. And during those discussions and moving forward, really the number one priority, of course, is to reduce loss of life. So search and rescue operations really need to be better coordinated, and as a first priority, we need to make sure that these deaths at sea come to an end. Second, of course, we need more coordination to do identification, screening, and protection of refugees and other vulnerable populations in these flows. So looking at ways that states can work better together to implement these screening mechanisms and prevent refoulement. And the third one that I really want to emphasize, because I think it's so important, is the need for safe legal pathways. So, really, people will not stop taking to the seas until they have other ways to reach safety. And some of the suggestions UNHCR has put forward are, other innovative migratory solutions, humanitarian visas, better family reunification options, even employment, labor schemes or student visas. There's a whole variety of options for states to provide ways for people to reach a safe place without having to hire a criminal smuggler, pay $5,000 and take to the seas where there's a high chance of death. And I've been this year with the Olympics so inspired by Yusra, the Olympic swimmer from Germany. She's Syrian national, and she participated on the first UNHCR refugee Olympic team, and she received a lot of media attention. And her story is really amazing. She and her sister, who were both swimmers in Syria, they ended up they were en route from Turkey to Greece, and their boat was, capsizing. The two of them swam and carried the boat along for 3 hours to reach safety. She and her sister then walked for, weeks to get to Germany, where their father was. And it's a story that's inspiring and, brings a tear to everyone's eye. But I often think that there could have been other options for someone like Yusra. She shouldn't have had to take to the seas. She's this inspiring, deeply sympathetic young woman coming from a war-torn country, and her father was already in Germany. We need to create more opportunities for family unification, for victims like her to not have to risk their lives. So thank you for addressing this issue in this forum, and it's a very important issue. So.
Well, thank you very much, Katie, and I'm really delighted that you ended on the note you did with the need to create more legal pathways, and it's certainly one of the things we look at in the book, looking back above all to the biggest and sort of most consequential example of international cooperation on this issue, which you know, you go all the way back to the post-Vietnam era and the comprehensive plan of action under which over 1 million people were resettled out of camps in Southeast Asia and directly from Vietnam, which was an agreement made very explicitly to create an alternative to these extremely dangerous boat journeys. Only Michelle and I are old enough to remember this, but it was very important. And I would like to turn to Michelle now to tell us about his observations in Greece and some of the deterrence strategies that are being folded into lots of other policy areas these days.
Thank you very much, Kathleen. And when I first met Kathleen, it was over 20 years ago, and I remember you're already working on Haitians taking to boats, yeah? So you've been on that topic for a long time. So that book is really, really, really welcome, I think.
About time.
Yeah, about time. I want to make 3 points, perhaps. The first one is this famous Turkish-EU agreement working? 2, what are the legal rights of the people who are currently stranded in Turkey? And 3, what are the conditions in which they live while they remain stranded? So the Eastern Mediterranean route is the most recent of the maritime route. It developed in 2015. Well, until 2014, people were taking the central Mediterranean route. And then the smugglers found a much cheaper way to bring people across and therefore to increase tremendously the volume of migrants. The EU failed to propose, I would say, a due process to receiving these people when they arrived in Europe, and that led, as the countries were starting really bickering among themselves, to the EU-Turkey deal, which was a sort of attempt by the EU to bring some sort of commonality among the position of the different EU countries. Now, has it worked? The EU will tell you yes, because the numbers have plummeted from thousands a day. They are now to hundreds a week arriving on the coast of Greece. And I want for evidence the declaration of Donald Tusk at the meeting that President Obama convened on refugees in the margin of the General Assembly on 20 September, where he crowed really the success of the agreement in protecting the borders of Europe. And then he added, quite strangely and sounding almost like an Australian official, that asylum would be preserved in Europe through resettlements. So one thing is that, of course, resettlement places are not there at present, but also to equate asylum to resettlement means that he probably has to read the convention before he makes such statements. The big question now that the numbers have gone down in Greece is, could these numbers go up again? Is this agreement going to last, or no, in influencing numbers only? And we got very different views when we were in Greece from officials or from NGOs, etc. What is certain in our view, and I was there with my colleague Isa, who's sitting here, and you can ask her some questions after. What is certain is that nobody is prepared for an increase if that is going to happen. So that would be a disaster. My guess is that now Frontex is patrolling the sea, and if there were to be a sharp increase in numbers, the EU would probably respond with a sort of naval barrier to prevent resumption of what we saw in 2015. But that's my wild guess. That was really the elephant in the room, and everybody has the politics of the ostrich. It might happen, but let's not even think about it because it would be too horrible to manage. So you have at present about 60,000 people who are stranded in Greece since the border were closed. And the rights of these people are extremely complicated to assess. There's been a whole series of conditions imposed on who came until which date, before or after the agreement. Where do you come from, whether you come from Afghanistan, from Syria, or from some other countries. And I can mention very quickly what are the different pathways the people can follow, but certainly what is happening in the different countries is that there is very poor information given to people, and they're extremely confused, and there are efforts to provide this information, but are still extremely confused as what they should sort of opt for. People Syrians who arrived before the agreement can opt for relocation. The EU offered 160,000 places for relocation in Europe between Italy and Greece. I think there were 66,000 for Greece. That was a program for 2 years. We are more than, a year since this offer was made, and so far barely 6,000 people have been relocated. So the EU made an offer, and it's not coming up with the facility. So people who are entitled to relocation because they arrived before the 20th of March are still stranded because that process is going extremely slow. Others are not allowed. The only people who are allowed were the Iraqis until July. And there the EU put up a completely arbitrary threshold. They look at Eurostat statistics. They say nationalities that get an average of over 75% recognition rate in Europe will be allowed for relocation. Those who are below 75% are not allowed. The Iraqis, until July, were above 75%. They may be now at 72, we don't know, and therefore they're not allowed for relocation. It's a completely arbitrary threshold that does not take into consideration, individual circumstances, which is what protection is basically based on, to look at the individual needs. Those who arrived, therefore, before the agreement was passed and are not Syrians or are not Iraqis if they came after July, have to apply for asylum or decide to go back and therefore go and see IOM and ask for a voluntary return, which some of these are taking place to some countries. For those who arrived after 20 March, the only possibility is to ask for asylum in Greece. But for that, they have to go first to an admissibility procedure. And that admissibility procedure is carried out by Greek authorities with some support for the European Asylum Support Office. There is an appeal procedure to that. So far, we were told that while there was quite a bit of negative after the first stage, in the appeals, there have been very few cases that have not been corrected. So it seems that the Greeks have been quite open to say these people indeed and have a reason to be here. I hope this will stay on. We don't know, but so far they've been quite good. I'll come after to the sort of pressure that Greece is receiving. And if they're not admissible, then they have to go back. And they can choose to go back through the IOM process, which at least gives them some money and some dignity in the way they go back, or they will go back through other mechanisms that have not been really established. So far, we understand that most of the returns have taken place through these voluntary mechanisms with IOM. RSD is very slow. In the EU-Turkish agreement, there was a commitment by the EU to send experts to support Turkey, who all of a sudden had to deal with a much higher number of applicants than they traditionally had to do. The EU has not supplied even half of the experts that were required. So again, the process goes extremely slow. And then there are vices in the process where, for example, on the admissibility, they have decided to prioritize the countries that have a very low recognition rate, like Moroccans, Egyptians, Algerians, Cameroonians, etc., whenever they came. So what you have vulnerable Afghan families who've been there for 8 months and who are seeing young guys coming from Algeria or something like that who have less chances to qualify, being processed much faster. So the lack of information and the fact that there is no orderly way in which cases are analyzed creates a lot of tension between these different nationality groups. And it's a failure of due process, I would assume. Now, my guess is that because of these nationalities that don't have a high recognition rate, the EU thinks if we can return them quickly, we will make numbers, if you want, because the others will require time to process through the asylum procedure, etc. So again, numbers is the priority, not the rights of people, and that is, I think, one of the most disturbing elements we found. Then there's, of course, family reunification is a possibility for all of them. It goes extremely slow. So you have people who probably are entitled to family reunification. We saw quite a few of them. We interviewed quite a few of them, but it's going to take ages.
Is this under regulations?
Yeah.
Sorry.
So that's for the rights of people. To date, we have the impression that Greece wants to uphold standards in processing people. And I say we have the impression, because so far we were told, the numbers seem to confirm that, we were also told that there is pressure at extremely high level on the Greek government by member states to review the way they are processing, because they were, for example, extremely concerned that on the admissibility procedure, the appeals were very generous, and they put pressure on the government to remove the Greek Human Rights Commission from the appeal board and to redefine an appeal board that would be less sympathetic, if you want, to asylum seekers. And how far this pressure will go, we don't know, but I mean, it is at the level of heads of state, and when we see what Mrs. Merkel discussed when we went there, it was a discussion where almost the executive is taking priority over the judiciary, which is, of course, a troubling development when you talk about the protection of basic rights of people. So people are stranded for a long time because all these processes are complex, people don't know how to access them, and they take a lot of time because there are not enough human resources. The conditions in which they have to live during this time are pretty horrifying, considering we are in Europe, which has to apply some standards. Most of the settlements, if you look at the concentration of people, some people stay for months into these little igloo tents on the floor. The food is not good. Water is cut intermittently. I mean, it's quite pathetic, except for one camp we saw, which was run by a municipality. So again, it can be done if it's the right authority that runs the place. But when it's the army, etc., it's certainly not appropriate. And what we were, I think, is the first refugee situation I visited in years where I was told money is not the problem. The NGOs are awash with funding from ECHO. We were told, I don't have evidence for that, but we were told that the Greek government has received a lot of money also from the EU, I would suppose from the DGs. So money does not seem to be the element, the reason for the poor conditions in the settlements. It does lead to pathetic individual stories. I mean, we have seen, women head of households with young children living in very basic conditions, 2 meters away from tents, where you have a bunch of very young, single young men who get drunk at night, etc. People are terrified. Security is an issue. Security is not guaranteed in the camps. And I think all that could be organized pretty well, considering that the numbers now, 60,000, it's high, but compared to what we know in other countries, it's pretty slow. So there, I think, as much as the Greek government, I think, is trying to do a good job on processing people according to acceptable standards, I think when it comes to maintaining them, it's not well done. And I am quite surprised to see that given the amount of money that was provided, there's not much request for accountability. And it seems a little bit, let's throw money at that, and as long as the numbers go down, this is fine. And that's a little bit the conclusion we had, is right now the game number, which plays with the politics in Europe, is the priority in the implementation of this agreement, not the rights of people. And I could not agree more with Katie and you when you say that unless we develop legal pathway for people to come to Europe, this is going to happen. It was quite striking that close to a family that is desperate, you find a young man who's quite happy to meet in the camp, just arrived, smokes his water pipe, and you ask him, are you going to ask for his, oh no, I'm going to Germany. And he said, but now the border is blocked. With money, there is no problem. So new smuggling routes are being developed out of the settlements in Greece. They are going to be more expensive, therefore affordable only to the wealthiest of the refugees, if I can use the word wealth, which is probably a bit abusive, and probably through much more risky routes. But it's not the end of smuggling. They are going to find alternative pathways.
Squeezing the balloon. Yes, quite a lot of creativity on that front. I particularly was struck by the people crossing the Arctic border with Norway on bicycles.
Something
Lisa,
to add over?
add anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, so I was mentioning this, we just got back a couple of days, oh, thanks, a couple of days ago, and I think that what really struck me was also, I mean, within this whole sort of very complicated picture of who, what nationality you are, when you arrived, what you're entitled to, there's a number of people who are just in limbo, especially Iraqis, Afghans, who are a high number of people, and who really, a lot of, I'd say probably most of them in need of protection. and that's it. Their only option is to apply for asylum in Greece. There's no clarity on whether their asylum claims are being processed, whether it's, because in theory they could be returned to Turkey under the EU-Turkey agreement, but they're not being processed for admissibility. So I think, and the reality is that these people, like Michelle said, are in very unsafe conditions. That we were told repeatedly that the police in the camps do not set foot in the area where people are living. So it's just, I mean, you know, someone with a legal background, I just don't understand how you can be not enforcing the law on your territory, knowing there's criminal activity going on. So just to say that this is going on and people have been there, some of them for 7-8 months, no one to protect them, and, you know, just in limbo, and that's extremely concerning.
It's really extraordinary to see this happening in Europe, and I can't help contrasting it in my mind with the refugee camps in Turkey, which hold only 10% or less of the refugee populations in Turkey, but our living conditions are very good in physical terms, and I think in terms of protection. Let me pose and discussion period is now officially open, so you're welcome to both to send us questions on Twitter or to @migrationpolicy using the event hashtag MPI Discuss, or emailing us at events@migrationpolicy.org. And those of you who are here only have to put your hand up. But I wanted to ask Michelle, first of all, if you, and Issa, if you think these conditions in Greece, not to be conspiratorial about it, but is this part of a deterrent strategy? Or, and it seems to me that the deterrence is more because of the risk of getting stuck in Greece, so that actually the closure of the Balkan route is probably more of a deterrent than conditions. But I'd be interested in knowing your...
I'm conspirational.
You are.
And this certainly occurred to us. Nobody denied that. Mm-hmm. Nobody said there is a clear instruction. Of course, you wouldn't be able to trace that, but I think it makes sense. And indeed, there are people who are saying, you know, I can't move, conditions are terrible, I'm going back. Yeah. And we've seen that among Syrians and among some Africans, etc. So, you know, my guess is that there's a hope that the more the procedure is long and the more the conditions are poor, the more people will eventually say, well, let me go back, which will disprove the fact that they need protection. So it's
this
fairly...
is sort of the Australian method, and we haven't talked about Australia. There is a chapter in the book on Australian policy, and here you see some of the routes.
On that point, if I may, the interesting thing is that because they are in the country, the courts have a say in Greece, and the courts have taken position in defense of asylum seekers. The Australians were very careful to dump people in islands where Australian law would not apply, so that they would never even have that level of protection. At least that is guaranteed in the Greek case.
Yeah, although the Australian court did prevent Australia from making an agreement with Malaysia on the grounds that it was not a signatory to the Refugee Convention, but by placing people in indefinite detention in Nauru, which is too small to even be seen on the map here, and on Manus Island in Papua New Guinea, although the Papuans have said that they're going to close that camp. But indefinite detention or very prolonged detention as a deterrent strategy seems to be one that is certainly being given consideration by increasing numbers of countries. And the Australians in some ways modeled themselves on the US policy in the Caribbean, where there was just, you can't get there from here. If you are interdicted in the Caribbean, you will not be allowed to settle in the United States no matter what. But we're not putting people in Nauru. I mean, we are looking for third country resettlement, and you know, people have gone to places like Slovenia and Canada and indeed Australia. So, I mean, how do you see this sort of deterrent strategy? Do you think that's working in the Caribbean, or is it just another case of squeezing the balloon?
It's a great question. I think that, of course, right, the interdiction practices and you know, the inability, if you are interdicted, to then come to the U.S. Serves as a deterrent. But if you look at specifically, I think Cuba-U.S. policies, stronger than that deterrent is the existing policy, the wet foot, dry foot policy, that gives a huge incentive for people to make the journey and arrive at the U.S. So I think as long as that policy is in place, that's such a tremendous incentive for people to make the crossing by sea, that it will continue to trump any deterrent.
Yeah, and you said you've seen an uptick in interdictions recently in the...
There's been about a 65% increase in interdictions of Cubans in the fiscal year 2016 compared to the year prior. I think likely has to do with you know, the thawing of relations with Cuba and the U.S. and misconceptions that there be policy changes to the Cuban Adjustment Act and the wet foot, dry foot policy. But yeah, there's been a huge increase.
Yeah, anticipating the possible end of wet foot, dry foot. Comments, questions from any of you? Joanne, just wait for the mic one second.
Sorry, thank you. Yeah, Joanne van Selm. Michelle, I'd be interested to know if there's any part of the EU-Turkish deal that the EU officials will point to as being the element that's working or giving the evidence other than the numbers. What I mean is, you know, if it's simply the deterrent effect of there being the deal and the potential for the return to Turkey, the one-for-one swaps, those kind of things, if that's putting the smugglers off for now or putting people off for now from taking the journey or any other element of that, that can obviously flip. That's not the deal working, that's the threat of the deal working. Are they pointing at anything in particular from the deal, from what they're actually doing as a part of the deal, that's having the impact on the numbers? Or is this something where, you know, from one day to the next as winter comes, etc., we can just see a massive change taking place? Because obviously we're all very cynical about the deal and it's very controversial, but I know they claim, just because of the basis of the numbers in Greece, that means it's working. We see the squeezing of the balloon, but is there anything specific that they're saying is causing that effect?
I'll also add, when you finish, Michelle, from our conversation yesterday with Echo.
Yeah. There's one hypocrisy in all that I learned when I was there that I was not aware. The deal requests that Turkey should determine, that Greece should determine for Syrians who even they might recognize as refugees, whether Turkey is a safe country to return them. Now, so far, there haven't been such returns taking place, so we don't know whether they would apply that. But it's very interesting that the EU asked Turkey to do that when I learned there by UNHCR that none of the European member states have legislation that allows them to define Turkey as a safe country. So they're trying to have one of their member states, because it's convenient, to basically do something different than what the rest of the Union does. It's quite a strange approach, you know, to be polite. Look, on the deal, there is one aspect which I think could have been positive, except it came too late. I mean, there are who travels towards Europe? The people who can pay the smugglers. Lots of refugees in Turkey who have exhausted completely whatever little money they brought when they fled Syria, who don't find jobs. We have kids working. We have seen an increase of transactional sex, etc. So they're very poor refugees in Turkey, and Turkey never qualifies for development aid because it's a mid-level income country. Now the deal offered quite substantive money to Turkey, 6 billion euros in principle, to assist for the integration of refugees. Now that should have come before the movement, just to make sure that people are helped in Turkey, but not as a sort of payment for the Turks to prevent the movement, no. So the idea that more money could be spent in Turkey to help people down there. We have seen people said, I came because I couldn't work. You know, people don't necessarily want to go to Europe. Many did that out of despair, and those who still had the money say, I spent my last bit of money in moving because otherwise I didn't know where I was going to go. So the idea to support Turkey in helping refugees is a good one, but as it's linked to all these political aspects in the deal where Turkey had other interests, you know, like the visa issue and reopening of accession discussion, etc., has put the interest of refugees, asylum seekers in the bottom of the priorities of the deal, and I think that's what's eminently wrong with the deal.
One thing that they is the humanitarian aid that is going neither through the development route nor the political route, but through the European humanitarian operations. And just in the last few days, they've announced, the EU and Turkey have announced an arrangement through which 350 million euros will be distributed directly, like through cash cards, to Syrian refugees in Turkey, to the most vulnerable, so to those very poor. And they say that will benefit 1 million refugees. Well, you know, you do the math, that's like 350 euros per beneficiary. I don't think we've been able to find out if that's per family or per individual, which would make a lot of difference, but I suspect it's per family. Still, you know, it's a help when people are struggling to pay rent, to sort of buy food. And I have to say that we've just done a case study on Turkey on reduction of poverty among forced migrants, and with Brian, my colleague here, has done heavy lifting on that. And, you know, Turkey their policy is evolving, and they really, despite all the political turmoil in Turkey and so on, they've been really good to Syrian refugees. And with, you know, an evolution toward more secure status, the opening of the possibility of getting a work permit, residence permits, gradually integrating Syrian children into the Turkish educational system, starting, I think, with this school year, all first graders will go into Turkish schools rather than to separate Arab language schools. You know, freedom of movement. So, you know, for absorbing this tremendous number of people, I mean, Turkey is roughly the same size as Germany, of course, not nearly as wealthy, and has getting on toward 3 million refugees. So there's a lot to criticize Turkey for on other fronts, and one can certainly be cynical about it, but they've really been pretty good. And we had the Director General of ECHO here yesterday, and she was pointing to what she insisted was a really strict separation of the humanitarian assistance from the political and even the development streams, because we're seeing development aid being more sort of aligned with political objectives in many parts of the world, but the humanitarian stream seems to be sort of picking up momentum, and particularly with this sort of innovative way of making sure that the money goes directly to refugees through a cash card, rather than winding its way through the bureaucracy where half or more of it tends to sort of get spent on overheads. So that, I mean, that's one thing, that if these billions from the EU, if more of it gets channeled into the humanitarian stream, I think that is something that may persuade people that they don't have to move in order to survive, which of course meets a lot of objectives. You'd be so kind as to introduce yourself, if you...
I'm Jessica Kaplan from UNHCR, and I have a question for Kate Hooper on the Gulf of Aden. So you all have talked about different interdiction and deterrence efforts in the Caribbean and the EUTurkey Deal. And when I think about Yemen and Somalia, these sort of hotbeds of international terrorism, it seems like something that the US or the West would be very interested in being involved in these flows. And I'm wondering if you could talk about what sort of interdiction efforts or protection at sea efforts were in that region.
Sure. So again, this is a really difficult area of the world to really sort of intervene in because this is a very lawless region. What you do have is you have patrols along the coast of Yemen, operated by the Yemeni authorities, and they work very closely with different humanitarian organizations who will record people who arrive on the coast. So that's how we have the data on arrivals. And also refer them to sort of protection procedures. So they'll take them to camps where they can be processed and sent on their way and sort of take care of them. You're right, it's a really difficult area to deal with. I mean, we have Somali piracy. It's very insecure in Yemen. I mean, a lot of the patrols, particularly along the sort of Gulf of Aden coast, have stopped because of the war. And again, it's very difficult to really sort of patrol along the Somali coast as well. So people are really doing what they can, but in very difficult conditions. We've seen, as I mentioned earlier, we've seen flows going in both directions because of the Yemen civil war. And so there's a presence in Djibouti that's been processing returnees from Yemen. But at the same time, you have people who are coming from Ethiopia and are then stranded in Djibouti because they're trying to cross the other direction. So it's just a very complicated situation.
With a lot of people trying, again, Yemen, as Kate pointed out, Yemen is a country of transit. There are not many people who are aiming to settle in Yemen at this point, but they are trying to get to Saudi Arabia, even as Saudi Arabia is sending people back. The lure of jobs in the Gulf is really a powerful one. But Yemen has, I think it's after 2010, remind me, they have worked pretty closely with UNHCR. They accept Syrians, prima facie refugees, not that they get many, but and Somalis. I'm not sure, but if people manage to get make contact with UNHCR, then there are some sources of help. But of course, so many are just managed by smugglers and are passed from one smuggler to another. And that's where the really terrible abuses happen, abuses of the kind that Kate described.
And another trying to evade detection. So if you're trying to travel on to Saudi Arabia, you don't want to be registered with Yemeni authorities. You want to evade that. You want to keep going. So that's where you're in the most danger because you're relying on these smugglers who, there are numerous reports of people kidnapping migrants, extorting them for money, abusing them. So it's a really terrible situation.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Becca Bayless. I'm from Georgetown Law, and I'm researching border externalization and outsourcing of migration controls into third countries, or in this case, into the seas, actually open seas. So first of all, I'm really grateful for this panel that looks at so many different case studies, and this text will be really useful as well, so thank you. But something that I've been interested by is this access to asylum issue, and so the case in point is the EU-Turkey situation where you can say that Turkey is giving some benefits, but even Syrians don't actually get refugee status in Turkey, and there's been documentation of a number of other nationalities being returned, Afghans specifically, without any kind of refugee status determination. So I guess what I'm really asking in the bigger picture is if you can have any accountability for destination states, in this case the EU, for imposing that type of system. And then secondly, and just in Turkey in general, if you foresee any future change. I mean, something else that's come up, I was in Turkey this summer, and something else that I was seeing and noticing, reading in the media, is that there are actually flows from Turkey to Europe, to Greece, to Italy, after the attempted coup, and how that might change the EU-Turkey deal if there are enough Turks actually claiming asylum in Europe. Thanks.
Brian, you might want to.
Oh, sorry, I thought you meant. Okay. I just wanted to mention that I think a fundamental problem with the EU-Turkey agreement. I mean, there are many issues in terms of the conditions in Turkey, etc. But I think that what the EU is really missing is that giving money is not a substitute for accepting people and processing their claims, and that's why tens of thousands of people are stuck in Greece. There's already nearly 3 million in Turkey, etc. So there seems to be this idea in European Union countries that by paying they can keep the problem away, and that's just not possible. People aren't getting access to the protection they need, and therefore people will continue to make the journey. And we didn't actually hear so much about, we asked the question about Turks leaving after the coup, etc. We heard that there have been some cases, which is, not a lot. It's very awkward for Greece, obviously, to be in that situation, but it didn't come up as a particularly,
Would you pass the microphone to Brian Salant, who's
Yeah, thank you.
this issue in Turkey?
Just about Turkey a little bit, I agree that there have not been that many cases of people leaving and seeking asylum because of the coup. In Germany the other day, I think that's what you were thinking about, between 25 and 35 people applied through diplomatic channels. I don't envision much changing in the policy right now of how Syrians are treated in Turkey. I think that they are moving toward policies of integration and how to get these people working, and that's why they're working on work permit policies. There had been one that came out in January, and there will be regulations to update that and correct how the processes are carried out for that policy. There's also been talk of Syrians being granted citizenship, especially Syrians who have skills that are desired in the Turkish market. And there's been another working law in Turkey, an international workforce law, that also shows their importance, or the importance that they place on skilled workers coming into the Turkish workforce. But those things are mostly speculation for now, so it's not known if Syrians are going to be given citizenship and to what extent they will be given citizenship, though it is a space to watch in the coming year or two as people stay on and Turkey feels more of the pressure of integrating them into their systems. And as Kathleen, as you said, bringing Syrian children into the education system is one large step, but then also for people working in the workforce age, that is incredibly important.
Within Turkey, as there are within Germany, who see the refugee population as down the road a source of economic stimulus and skills, but it takes a long time. And Brian and I are heading to Turkey on Sunday, in fact, and watch this space. Brian will probably be publishing something on the work, the laws and regulations surrounding work in Turkey. So it's a space we're watching. We have a question here. Susan, did you want to add something on that? Okay.
Hi, I'm Caitlin from the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops Migration and Refugee Services, and I was just wondering, in your research on maritime migration and migration routes, if you found any instances of trafficking or looked into that issue at all, especially in the Asian routes?
Yes, certainly, and it's a concern on I think pretty much on all of the routes. Maybe not so much in Australia, because that is a very tightly controlled situation. But people who have the option of settling permanently in Nauru, well, there's only one case of someone who was actually voluntarily settled in Cambodia and stayed there for more than a few months. But I think those would be the situations in which one would be most concerned about trafficking in that theater. But elsewhere, refugees, particularly in the hands of smugglers, are extremely vulnerable. And we see people sort of disappearing from the migrant streams. Whether we're talking about Central American children or whether we're, talking about people in Europe making their way up, from Italy into the rest of Europe. I think it's a huge concern. I mean, we haven't focused on it, specifically in this book, but it's part of a context, I think, for everyone. Do any of you want to to that.
I mean, I think with the smuggler, where they seek out their services and pay them. But then this often sort of then bleeds into trafficking, where, you know, they're at the mercy of the smugglers. The smugglers can then sell them on to other people, or, you know, then exploit them while they're on their journey. And so it's difficult to sort of unpick, but, you know, often it turns from a voluntary relationship into something that becomes very exploitative later down the line. And migrants often aren't aware of the dangers when they're embarking on their journey, and it seems a very straightforward transaction.
Screening, for protection screenings, and to have the competent authorities, individuals that have the right training to identify refugees, victims of trafficking, other vulnerable populations, unaccompanied children within these mixed migration flows. And I think we see that a lot of those that are involved in migrant interdiction are, you know, they tend to be more in the enforcement field, you know, and perhaps never got into this because of, you know, they're more in the business of humans, you know, drug trafficking, search and rescue. Oftentimes it's the military that's doing migrant interdiction. And so, I think that's certainly a gap, having the right people doing the screenings.
By email from Michelle, which refers to the comments you made about living conditions for refugees and migrants in Greece. And the question is, what factors determine if migrant settlement camps are administered by the military or civilian, you know, municipality authorities or someone else? And where is EU money for Greece going, if not to the migrant settlement camps?
Well, I can't comment where the money is going. We were just told that there's been substantive support by the EU to Greece, but we have no proof of that, etc.
Yes, we heard that from
So,
ECHO yesterday.
yeah.
That it was 200 or 300
euros.
No, so good question.
Quite something, but certainly it doesn't translate into immediate change in the settlement. I think what happens that when the military run that, first they're not trained to do that. So they're not trained to have vulnerable people in a settlement, etc. They probably look at criteria in a completely different ways. And Greece doesn't have...
The blind man and the elephant.
Yes, and Greece doesn't have a tradition. I mean, they had the flow of refugee asylum seekers in the past that was manageable through the asylum system. So all that is quite new for them. And, you know, without considering whether there is an intent of deterrence or no, I think it's not the right... When it was municipalities, we saw one municipality which had a terrible camp in Chios, where we had these vulnerable people really mixed up with more dangerous individuals without any attempt to secure them, where kids can walk by the sea and fall in the water without any attempt to try to say, let's have a safe area for children. I mean, things that were quite shocking. And it was administered by the municipality. In Lesbos, municipality administers a perfect center for vulnerable groups. So I think there is a lot, there is no central directive on these are the criteria we should apply, etc. And this is the sort of thing that I think, this is where I think Greece is failing. While, as I say, on the process, I think they're trying the right thing. And you know, that's good given the pressure they have. But on the level of assistance, they could do much better. But I don't have a perfect answer to the question that was posed, because we asked to visit the camp. We were told no, so we went there through our means.
Thank you. Thank you. Please. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Rachel Landry. I just finished my master's at the Refugee Studies Center. And Kathleen, I really appreciate how you sort of categorize this issue as a wicked problem that maybe doesn't necessarily have solutions but can be managed. And so I was sort of wondering how you are thinking about managing this problem, and just to sort of give you an idea of sort of the way that I've been thinking about this.
Please.
So, you know, what I think is so challenging about this issue is, on the one hand, we see this crackdown on smuggling networks and smugglers sort of being targeted as a way to mitigate this problem, when of course it is safe and legal pathways that are most necessary. And we see smugglers, as you mentioned, engaging in lawfare, where they're actually taking, sort of deliberately engaging with legal norms, and in particular the duty to rescue at sea in order to engage these rescue situations. But then on the flip side, we're actually seeing the duty to rescue being suppressed. And, just to give an example, most recently, in January 2016 in Greece, a humanitarian organization, Team Humanity, one of their co-founders was actually arrested when they went out, coordinating with the Greek Coast Guard to engage in a rescue operation that was deliberately triggered by smugglers. And then this individual was actually arrested by the Greek Coast Guard and is now facing charges with human smuggling himself. So just to reiterate how, this is a wicked problem because it is so complex, and we see humanitarians and smugglers being conflated a lot. And so, just any insights you have into how you have sort of been thinking creatively about managing this problem would be greatly appreciated.
Thank you, Rachel, for really putting me in the hot seat in the last minute here. I think you're absolutely right there's this spectrum from rescue to smuggling to trafficking that's very hard to pin down, and for at least the last 10 years we have seen some humanitarian rescues. There was a group of Tunisian fishermen who took a group to Lampedusa, rescued a group of migrants and took them to Lampedusa in 2007, and then were held on smuggling charges for a year. We saw the captain of the Tampa, the notorious and really sort of game-changing case back in 2001, threatened with smuggling charges for attempting to land the people he had rescued on Australian territory. So this is really a spectrum that is, I think, many states have found that they have an interest in not clarifying that spectrum. I think in terms of how you manage this situation better, certainly one of the absolutely critical areas is around disembarkation, and once people are rescued, who's responsible for them, where can their adjudication procedures be. The U.S. does them on Coast Guard cutters. Many people, including commercial ship captains, have said, a ship should never be considered a place of safety. It's very much a temporary stopgap. So broader agreements on disembarkation of the kind that were negotiated in the South China Sea back in the late 70s and 80s, where there were clear rules that ships that rescued people in peril at sea would not be penalized and would be able to disembark them in a timely way, is something that needs to be more broadly adopted on a global basis. Secondly, I think, we really do need better data on what is happening with all these people. There's so much murkiness, and there's some good practice, like a group Kate has worked with in the Horn. The Regional Mixed Migration Secretariat is, a model that I know is being considered for other parts of the world that would certainly help to clarify what's going on. And then we need to monitor the impact of policies. What is the consequence when you squeeze the balloon in one place, or are there really constructive things that are working? It's surprisingly hard to find out, and we need more information about that, including better information on people's motivations and routes, and which includes the smuggling routes, and to find out to what extent are they in the hands of criminal enterprises? To what extent are they helping people, or to what extent are they exploiting them, and where, where can you locate that distinction? And above all, as we've all mentioned, we need orderly departure programs that will sort of take some of this business out of the hands of criminal elements and make it possible for more people to travel safely. Now, that is not going to solve the problem. I think in the foreseeable future, there are going to be more people wanting to move than states are willing to accept, and that's one of the things that makes this a wicked problem. It's not going to be solved, but I think those are some of the ways that it can be managed better. So our time is up, a little more than up, and I'd really like to thank you all for coming, and especially to thank our panelists for giving us these varied perspectives on the basis of much study and much experience. So please join me in thanking them, and thank you all.